Good morning and welcome back to another lecture for web and mobile systems. In the last class, we had discussed the conceptual overview of the project that we were implementing, which was to basically design a interface for user survey collection and stuff like that. So to recap the idea of what the logical design of the app was that we were trying to build was it would be an app that will consist of two different screens. Okay. In the first screen, we would pose some questions to the users, which would be in the form of some sort of an MCQ type questions where they can pick on multiple different options that will be given to them. So it will be in the form of asking them things like, what is your favorite programming language? And you will give them multiple options and they can pick multiple options. They can pick one or more than one options or all of them. So something that will be implemented using probably the checkbox environment from the HTML form, but this time we have to implement that within the mobile environment and not on the web systems platform, right? And once the users have picked up all of or answered all of the questions that will be presented in the survey, then they will essentially click on some sort of a submit button. And once that submit button is clicked, it will be redirected, or the users will be redirected to the second screen that will be present, which will give them a confirmation of the responses that they have provided in the first screen, basically. Okay, so essentially implementing this leaves you with the flexibility of kind of if you understand the interactions that are taking place in this particular prototype, that gives you the flexibility to kind of implement many different types of functionalities, which will follow some similar patterns like the one that we are implementing right now. Okay, so doing this, in trying to implement this logical design, we understood how to set up the native environment. We talked about the emulator, the Android emulator in particularly, and briefly discussed about the emulator that is available on the Mac OS side. Unfortunately, I cannot demo that to you due to the unavailability of that infrastructure. But if you are a Mac user, then you can either use Xcode or you can use the Android Studio emulator as well. And if you are on the Windows side, then you only have the option of using Android Studio. In addition to that, we also have another environment to test our code and see how it is working, if everything looks good and stuff like that. And that can be done using what we call as the Expo Go application, which is available both on Google Play Store as well as the Android App Store. So if you download that on your smartphones or on your handheld devices, essentially when you run the server within the Expo environment of Visual Studio Code, you can scan the QR code that is provided. And then essentially you can view or test the code directly on your cell phones, as long as both the cell phone or the smartphone, along with the Visual Studio Code server is resting on the same Wi-Fi network. Okay, otherwise you will have to tunnel it. All right. And the two main concepts that we are covering through this prototype, other than the core components of React Native, which basically isn't a lot, is to basically learn first and foremost how React navigation is performed on the native platform, because the essence of navigation is entirely different when you deal with the native platform. There is no concept of HTML pages. So the naturally occurring or the natural way of navigation that we implement on the web interfaces using the anchor tags that we are familiar with in HTML that allows pages to reload on the web platform system, that is no longer applicable here, because if you incorporate an anchor tag in a mobile application, that will essentially start a new application, which is basically the web browser that is present in your native devices, and it will take you outside of the native apps environment altogether, right? So the React navigation here is done using an external third-party package for native platforms, and we call that package as the React navigation native package. Okay. And we saw how to set that up in the last class, how to install those packages and how to incorporate those features and essentially implement what we call as stack navigation for our native platform. So you have to keep in mind that the app and the different screens that are present in your app, so there will be no concept of pages anymore. You will have what we call as screens, and within the screens, you will make functional calls, as we learned in the React library, to various components that will be responsible for facilitating some piece of functionality within your application itself, right? So the whole idea is that you will have screens. Screens will invoke components within them, and then you will consolidate or bring together all of the screens on your landing page, which is app.js, right? So that is basically the idea. And if you're familiar with the data structure stack, then you would recall the fact how the stack data structure works essentially. Like so it will be first in, last out, or last in, first out policy that is used for that particular data structure. So what happens is when you load an application on any mobile device, right, on any native platform, the navigation essentially starts off with this first screen being entered into that stack container. And then if that first screen is redirecting to, let's say, another screen, then that screen comes on top of it. If you need to go back, right, then that screen is popped out of that stack, and then whatever is the next level or whatever is the next state of the stack container, that is what users will essentially view on their side when interacting with a user interface that is built for the native platform, right? So that is basically stack navigation. The second conceptual component, which we will eventually reach to the point, is how to implement global state management using third-party packages. And the third-party packages that we are essentially going to learn here is known as Redux. Okay, so the whole idea of Redux was that when we learned state management in the React domain, right, the React.js domain, we learned it using just a hook called useState, which is very good when it comes to local state management. That is, if you are performing state management, if you're trying to track the state of different data, and that data could be stored in a variable, an object, an array of object, whatever it may be, it is very good for that particular purpose, right? Just tracking it within that functional component that within which you are trying to keep a track of the state. But anytime that you would have to kind of push the state to another component that is owned by a different component, and then changes happen there, and then you will have to update that change back to the original component which owns that state, then this interaction becomes quite tedious if you're only relying on local state management, because you have to kind of bring in other features such as using React props and then be able to kind of push it back, and then there will be nested functional component calls within all your functional components. So it gets very untidy at a certain point of time. So it is not impossible, but it is not the most effective way, right? So what React Redux provides us with is what they call as the global state management. So we create this data store which wraps your entire application, and then any sort of state management, any sort of update or read and write operations essentially to those different states is done by having the functional components interact directly with the Redux data store, which is basically responsible for holding on to all of the different states of coming from any different functional components, right? So it makes life much easier in scenarios where you know for a fact that you would have to move around your state components or basically states owned by different components into other components. So the example that we have in this situation, it's a fundamental example, but it can grow up in scale if you add more screens and stuff like that, is that when the user submits their responses to these questions, this is basically a state, right? Because they will be selecting different options. Those options could be true and false because they are MCQ questions. So the values or the bound of values that each option can take will be either true or either false, right? So that is a state tracking that we have to implement, right? And that is something that will be owned by the state will be owned by the component, which will be invoked within the first screen, okay? So, and then if you look at what the outcome, the logical outcome of the second screen is, we have to give a confirmation of the responses. So that means that this particular screen, whichever component it will be invoking, needs to have access to the component of the first screen, right? So that means we have to move the state around a little bit, right? So if you set up with Redux, it becomes easier because then these components, which are on the first screen and the second screen, they don't have to interact between each other. They can simply interact with what we call as the data store of the Redux, which is essentially at the end of the day responsible for keeping a track of all different states. Okay, so we talked about the conceptual setup of Redux in the last class. What are the different components that will be involved? What are the different hooks that you will need when working with Redux as well? So we will move forward and we will start discussing about how to finish up this implementation. Okay, so if you remember real quick, we had talked about the setup for the React Native stack application. So we needed 3 different libraries that we had installed there. And let's move this a little bit to the right so we can increase the screen a little bit. Okay. All right, so we installed 2 different packages and we need 2 different containers or 2 different objects from those packages. So the first package is the React Native React Navigation Native, from which we are bringing in the actual container, the stack data structure that we keep on referring to. That is basically coming within this object called navigation container, which is coming from the React Navigation Native package. Okay, and then we need to set up the navigation within that container, right? So to move between screen 1 to screen 2 to screen 3 and then back, this nature of traversal, that will be done by this particular object, which is create native stack navigator, right? This is the container and this is the navigator itself, which is coming from this particular package, which is React Navigation Native Stack. So these are the 2 different packages, and essentially there is a third package, which is the native React Navigation Native, but installed for Expo. Okay, because remember, Expo is a wrapper around our React Native project, right? So these 2 packages are specifically for React Native, but Expo doesn't understand these packages. So if we do not implement the package which will allow Expo to translate what we are doing here by utilizing these 2 packages, Expo won't be able to deploy that functionality to either at the Android platform or the iOS platform. So that third package that we need is essentially the React Native navigation package, but for Expo and not React Native itself. Okay, so that is the third package. So we basically compile and build, install and build our Expo project to have that functionality. And we don't include that in the source code itself, because the source code in particular is for the React Native environment that is built using React and JavaScript itself, right? Once that is done, we bring in the import in the screens that will be essentially, pushed or provided as a path or as a source for our navigator. Okay, so we can set it up. The first thing that we do within our app component, which is where React is written as functional components. Okay, you can write class components, but right now functional component is more primarily used. Classes will come in the sense that if there is a functionality which is not supported by React, there is no hooks for it, and you have to write it from scratch, that's when you go for class definitions. But mostly right now it is functional. All right. So within the functional component of our app, this is the landing page, we create a new instance of the stack navigator. Okay. And then we store that instance within this particular object. And then within the return statement, within which we will have the actual piece of code that will be rendered out when this code is deployed on our native platform, whatever that platform is. We first wrap our entire application within that container, the navigation container, right? So we essentially, this will allow us to drop the entire app within that container that we're talking about, which the native platforms can understand. All right. Once we do that, then we wrap our entire app using this stack navigator object and then this navigator method. So this is basically a functional component call again. So we are wrapping it in the navigator. So we create the container, then we wrap the entire app within the navigator instance that we had created. And then we are making functional component call by again using the navigator's object, but this time instead of creating the navigator itself, we are calling on the screen method of the stack object, stack navigator object, and within that as props. So these are all props. If you recall the setup from React.js itself, this is not a React native syntax, this is a React syntax. We are passing a prop wherein we say that the name of the screen is going to be question screen, but when you try to look for this screen, you will replace it with the actual component call that is given within this file path, right? And this file path essentially is our screen. And then you can provide a lot of different options. One of the options that we are using is, since we are giving this a name, if we do not set header shown as false, then what will happen is that when the screen is loaded onto our platform, then it will have a header of itself, a label on the screen itself, which will say question screen, because this is the label that we have given to it, right? So in order to suppress this information, we are setting this option as header shown as false, right? So here you can see that this option is basically a set of objects. You can add more objects to it. There are a bunch of objects that you can add, right? And then we repeat this process for any number of screens that you have. So we are just doing it just to understand, for the sake of simplicity, with 2 different screens. You can add as many screens as you want. So the only missing piece of the puzzle that remains for now, and we are going to leave it as such for this particular deployment, is the fact that we need a trigger from one screen to go to the next screen. Right? So that means it could be the click of a button. It is basically going to be an event listener. It could be a click of a button. It could be a touch component. So whatever that is that you want to enable the trigger from, whichever type of interaction will allow or you think will be the best way to go to the next screen, that is what we need to implement, right? And that is just a one-line code. And we will come to that when we set up the rest of the application. And then we will kind of, tie the loop, close the loop, and finish off with that event listener trigger that will allow us to kind of go from this screen to this particular screen, right? And that essentially will again require us to use this stack navigator object that we have created, okay? We will essentially call the navigate function method of that object, which will allow us to go to the next screen, right? So we will come back to that part, but essentially this piece of code with the implementation of these 2 packages and the third one for Expo itself allows you to set up any sort of navigation that you want within your native platform, right? And that takes care of a major portion of your development part, right? Because otherwise you will end up having an app, which is a single page app. There is nothing wrong with that, depending on your functionality. If you want to build a single page app, then you don't need all these navigation stuff. But you have also seen some other examples where the app moved from one screen to the other screen, and you are capable of either pressing the back button to go to the previous screen, or you are able to use the hand gestures in things like iPhone. And even if you use that in Android phone, you can set it up. You can go to the previous screen and stuff like that, right? So those things are essentially done by using this simple piece of setup that we are seeing here, right? So the next thing that we will move on to, we will ignore all the CSS for the time being, is Redux, okay? We need to set the state management, because once you set up your navigation, once you set up Redux for state management, everything else is pretty much straightforward at that point of time. It is all up to you to figure out that what exactly do you want to put into your app logic, right? So let us move on to Redux now. So for Redux, remember, to refresh your memory, we have created a file in the root directory that is known as store.js. So this will be the landing page for our Redux, okay? So that means for our global state management, this is where we will start off with. And then we have also created this subdirectory. So I will minimize this screens folder and component for now. We have created this subdirectory called slices. So what happens is that your data store can be split up into different sections, and each section will be responsible for storing the state of a specific component in your application, right? So that is what we mean by creating slices of our data store. And each slice will be responsible for storing all the variables that pertains to a specific context or a component, right? So here we are creating one slice because we only have one state management situation coming from the questions component, right? So all of these questions will have different options, and we have to track if the user selected a particular option or not. So these are all state that pertains to a specific context, which is the context being the questions, the user survey questions that are provided on the first screen, right? So essentially we are taking our data store, which is the entry point for Redux, and that data store will wrap our entire application eventually. And within that data store, we are creating one slice. And if you follow the same pattern, you can create multiple slices, right? So if you understand the first slice, you can do the same thing for the next slices as well without any issue, right? So that's the slices part. And then within the slices, we will set up our getters, we will set up our setters, okay? So those are essentially what we need to perform read and write operation while interacting with the Redux data store, right? So let us go ahead and start working with Redux, okay? So before we can start, of course, we will need third-party packages, just like we had for React Native application as well. So I need to continuously keep on doing this. So I think it is AWS code commit and test, okay? And then CD into my Expo application, right? And then ls it, and yeah, so this is in the root directory. So I'm in the root directory right now. So the first package that I need is the Redux JS toolkit. Okay, so I'm going to use my package manager, which in this particular case, we are using yarn as an alternative to npm. If you want to use npm, it will be npm install and then the package name. If you're using yarn, then it will be yarn add and then the package name, right? So that is the major difference that we have. All right, so the first package that we want to bring in is the Redux.js toolkit, okay, which is basically the @Redux.js toolkit. And when you have these weird package name, I kind of like to wrap it around this string quotes so that it doesn't throw any errors, but you can try it out without the string quotes and see how it works out. If it goes through, that's absolutely fine, right? But this is the first package that we need for our Redux.js, the toolkit, okay? And remember, Redux is not specific to React Native. You can use Redux for React applications as well. And the process of setting it up is exactly the same, because when it comes to working with Redux in itself, it's more about setting up the Redux environment and not specifically about the project. Because what comes afterwards is you just wrap your entire application within that Redux environment that you have set up. Everything else remains the same. So if you're ever in a situation with a React project where you need global state management, you can follow these same steps to set this thing up, right? So even then you have to set up all these different packets. All right. So once the toolkit is set up, now we need to set up the library for the React Redux that can be used in these examples, right? So that package is known as React-Redux. So we got the toolkit in. So all the functionalities for Redux.js is in that toolkit, right? Now we need to have the package which will enable the usage of Redux with React, because Redux can be used with other technologies as well, and not just React and React Native, right? So right now we need the package which enables the communication or the setup or the interaction between the React code and Redux code, right? So this is essentially the library which will enable us to set that interaction up. So we got the Redux.js toolkit. So everything with respect to the Redux functionality will be present in that through that first library. And then to enable the interaction between React and Redux, we got that second library ported in, which is the React-Redux library. Okay. Once that is done, then we can move forward with the code. Okay. So everything is set up here. I will just go ahead and move out of this directory and move into my weird, okay, this is kind of bugging out already. Do you guys also see this missing characters like I am seeing, or are you guys seeing fine?
It's missing.
Yeah, missing, right? So it's kind of bugged out, but okay, we're not using this for the time being, but let's keep it as it. All right. So now the packages are in. The first thing that we will operate on is basically setting up our data store. Okay. So in the data store, the first thing that we need is the object from the Redux toolkit library that we installed as the first package. We need an object that is going to help us configure the store up or set up the prototype of the store. Remember the way we did for the navigation container, we first got the container and then whatever functionality we need to operate within that container. So what is the idea of Redux? We create a data store that will wrap our entire application, and then we can slice up that data store. So the first thing that we need to do is to set that data store up, configuration files, right, of the data store. So we are going to import this object, and we're going to use the destructuring method so that we don't have to use the package name dot and then the property that we're trying to use. So we are just going to use configure store. This is the object essentially that is required, and then it can automatically identify which package it is coming from because we had set it up here, installed it. So this is coming from the Redux.js functionality. It is not a part of React code. That will come later, right? We are essentially right now interested in setting up the toolkit itself. All right. So the next thing is we need to declare a store itself. So I'm going to name the store. Okay. And then the store will use this configure store call to this configure store because we're creating a new instance of a store, and that new instance of a store can be done through this constructor call of configure store. Within the configure store, we have to pass in the parameter of how we are going to reduce that store into different slices. Okay, so the way we want to do it is we want to call what is called a reducer, which essentially allows us to reduce that data store into multiple slices. Okay, so we can create those different slices that is present. So I'm going to pass in an object here, and within that object, I'm going to provide key value pairs. Okay, and that key value pair, essentially the first key or mainly the main key that you will have is how you are going to reduce the data store, how you're going to chop that data store down into multiple slices. Okay, so here the first key is going to be the reducer, and that will also take an object because I'm setting it up in a way where you can provide multiple slices if you ever are in a position to implement it, or if you need more than one slices. Because if I just have one slice, I can put it in. But here, if I put it as an object, then you understand that you can give a comma and put the next set of slices that you need. All right. So we need to give this a name. So a label for the key. So what is our first slice? That is the question that you have to ask. Now, we had already designed this in our head without the implementation when we're setting up the design, that we are going to slice up the data store and we're going to create one slice. And that slice is going to be this question slice.js file. That is all the information about what is the data, how to read that data, how to write that data. Those functionalities will go into this particular file, right? So when we are configuring the store, we need to tell Redux that this is the first slice where you will find all of that information about data management or state management, right? So that is going to be our first. So I'm going to give this a name, and I will say that it's going to be called question data, right? You can give whatever name that you want. This is essentially the key, right? So you are setting up the label, so you are giving that key, so you can give it whatever, but the value has to be specific, and the value needs to point to where the slice file is that you are essentially providing here in the configuration option. So we know that the slice file is inside this subdirectory within a file called question slice.js. So I need to get that into this, import it here. So I need to say import, and I need to give it a name, which will be recognized here within this particular file. So I will just say this is going to act as the question reducer. Remember this name, you can give whatever name you want, but when you are bringing it in, you need to give the correct directory. So I am in the root folder. So I will go into my, where is my slices folder. And then within slices folder, this is the file that I want to bring in, right? So this is what I am essentially getting. So now I can pick this guy up which is storing this file path name, and I can provide this as a value to my reducer that I'm creating, right? Or stuff like that. And this particular store, so this is the setup of the data store itself, right? So all you need to do is specify what are your reducers, right? So multiple different reducers, you're going to create multiple different input to this configure store. So every time you want to create one, go next, reducer, and then give a new key value pair, right? So you can set this up. Now, we also said that this data store needs to wrap the entire application such that the application can communicate with the data store itself. So that means eventually we will be in a scenario where this store that we have created here, it will be called upon by the application itself, right? So in order to do that, we need to export this store. So I'm going to set up the export default in the sense because there is only one component or one thing to export from this app. So it will default to that, right? If you have multiple stuff, we will see that we cannot use the default statement in the export. We will have to specify exactly what are we taking out, right? So here, what are we exporting? The store itself. So once we set up for the store to be exported, we can call this store. It's not a function, so we cannot essentially call it. What we will do is we will pass it as a prop to this app, essentially, okay? So not this app here, but when we call the navigation container and all those things, because this is wrapping the entire logic of the application itself, we will pass in as a prop the store somewhere, okay? So we will leave it at this, because next thing that we need to do, since we have imported the reducer here, providing that this is going to be our slice, so we need to essentially go to that slice and we need to create the actual state management now, right? So we are almost halfway there to set up the things, okay? So now the next thing is we need to work on this slices guy, and within that slices file is where we will perform the majority of the state management task. And if you remember state management, what was it all about? To set up the initial state, get your container, but that was in local state management. Here we have to establish getters and setters, both of them, right? And then that's it, right? So you have to set up your initial state. You have to set up a bunch of getters. You have to set up a bunch of setters for all the different variables that you're trying to track. That's all the actions that you have to implement in each slice. Each slice you can work on that. So I will go to my let's close this answer screen, question screen. So I will open question slice. Okay, so here, fresh file, we have to set it up. Now, again, we need one functionality from the Redux.js toolkit. And what are we doing here? So think about it this way. What did we do in the store file? We configured the store. What do we need to do in the slice file? We need to create a slice. So essentially, I will import a property from the Redux.js toolkit, which will essentially help us achieve that exact same thing. And it is called exactly what you think it is called, which is not create slide, create slice from the Redux.js toolkit. So this object will help us create the slice. So now, the first things that we have to ask ourselves is what values are you tracking, or let's say what values are you managing, or not values. Values is a pretty. What data are you managing in this slice? Okay, so that is the first question, because this will kind of inform you of what variables, what objects, what arrays do you need to declare, and then create a getter and setter for them, right? So that's exactly what this exercise is all about, right? So now we said that this is going to be a user survey form for the first screen. The slice is for that first screen itself. So it will give us questions like, what is your favorite language? And it will give us options such as A something, right? So I will just say 1, 2, 3. We don't have to write down the exact value per se. We can say, or let us just go ahead and do that. So we can say Python, or we can say Java, or we can say JavaScript, and blah, 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 right? Then we can give another set of questions, and we can say, where did you apply for internship? Something like this. Okay, and then we can give some company names. We can say FB, we can say Netflix, we can say Apple, we can say Google, whatever. You get the idea, right? So that means now if you're providing this, and then we have to identify that how we are also going to be presenting these options, because how you present it will have a direct impact on how you're going to store these values as well, right? Because if it's an input text, if they're going to write out the answer, then you need some kind of a string variable, right? But if they provide it the way we want to do it as a checkbox, right? Checkbox input type. So if this is the case, then we know for a fact that the value of the variables is either going to be true or it is going to be false. So essentially what we need is a Boolean. This is important. This knowledge is required. This mental exercise you have to do for your apps as well, so that you have a clear picture of how you want to set up your data, your slice, right? What are the different variables that you do? So once this is done, we understand that for every option, we have to create a variable which will be of type true or false, basically a Boolean variable. And then we can set the initial state to false, which will be resembling or kind of reflecting the fact that the checkboxes are unchecked, because if it's false, it's not checked. If it's true, it is checked, right? That's the whole idea. So if that is clear, then we can go ahead and do the first step that is required for any type of state management, whether it is global or whether it is local, which is to create the initial state, right? So the way we are going to create the initial state, we will create an object, and that object will have data members, which will essentially be all of the different options in this particular case, right? So we will say, get us a const initial state, and you can name const initial state user survey and give it a bit more intuitive name if you would like to. It's not easy to understand and stuff like that. So we want to create this initial state guy here. And what is going to be the initial state? The keys will be all the options that you provide to the user. So let's say if you want to write it in this way, if we can, instead of going through this, I'm just going to copy this. It's a lot of typing. Okay. All right. So this is basically what we have. And what did we put here? We are putting a language, because this question, the first question is going to be about your favorite language. So I just gave a prefix. It's going to be an option. And then what is the name of the option? So directly putting the name of the option is easy to identify what is happening when you're debugging codes like this, right? So I gave a language option for Python, set it to false. Similarly for Java, JavaScript, and the C language, okay, C++ language. The second question is, where did you apply for internship? That is a company-based question. So I gave a prefix of company, option, Facebook, Apple, Netflix, and Google, and set everything to false, okay? I hope you understand this. This is pretty straightforward. So we don't have to do anything. We don't have to do anything, but we don't have to worry about anything other than this. All right. So we have set the initial state, set initial state. Now, this is completely dependent on how you present your data, because how you present your data and how the interaction will take place will ultimately affect how you are going to store your initial state as well. So first, figure out the design. That is the important step, because design in these domains is just like writing algorithms in your traditional domain. If your algorithm is not strong foundationally, then you cannot write clean code, no matter how good you are with the language, right? It's always going to end up with a product which is shaky, right? So similarly here, design is everything. So you have to figure out your design, work on that, and then implement it, right? All right, so initial state is done. What we need now is basically we need to create our setters, okay? And then we need to create our getters. So we will work on the setters first, okay? Because this is something that will not be returned by default like the use state hook does. And that is the power of a hook, right? You don't have to write a lot of piece of code in order to avail the functionality. But here we have to create our setters essentially, right? And when we are setting up the setters, this operation, that is the creation of the setters, is tied up with the actual creation of the data slice. Okay, so these two processes go hand in hand. That is, when you create the actual, implement the actual data slice, which is being referred to here. Here we are saying that this is the slice which will come in the reducer, right? And the reducers will have all the set of setters. So that's the whole process here. So we need to create the slice as well as work on the setters itself. Okay. So in order to do that, we know that we had imported this person here in order to create our slice. So we will be finally making use of this person. And then as we create our slices, we are also going to create our setters. All right. So the first thing that we are going to do is we are going to set up the export statement, because remember this thing, this slice that we will create, this needs to be imported here. Okay, we have an import statement here, so we need to have an export statement. So we are going to do an export constant, but not default. Pay attention and keep this in mind that we are not doing an export default and then something, export whatever, right? The reason is this particular file will have multiple different export statements because it will export the setters and it will export the getters as well. So we cannot do a default export because there isn't just a single entity to export out of this file. So we just say export and then the name, right? And not export default and the name, all right? So what are we going to set up? We're going to set up a question slice. That is the name that we provided here. So there is a typo here itself. Okay, so we're going to set up this question slice by calling on the instance of create slice that we have imported here. So I'm going to call on create slice itself and its constructor. And then within the constructor is where I will pass in all of my different parameters, right? So let us end this here. And within this is where I will pass in all the parameters that is required to create the slice. Now, to create the data slice, what we need is three basic things, okay? What is the name of this data slice? So here we have given the name of the data slice here. You see this label will go looking for this reducer, which is present in this file. Okay, so once it visits it, it will check for where that name of the reducer is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this key value and I'm going to use that as the name of my data slice as well, so that there is some resemblances when this data store comes to this file to look for the reducers of this data file. Remember, reducers essentially will point to the setters itself. Okay, so we need to give it a name. All right, and the name is going to be the same as that of the key that I have provided here. Okay, this is just an additional step that I take for safety purposes, but there is no mandatory requirement here. Okay, so that there doesn't create any kind of mismatch with the naming conventions and things like that. We need to give it a name. Anytime you declare your use state React hook, what do you provide it as a parameter? You provide the initial state of the data. So here, to create the data slice itself and then set up the reducers, or which basically is the setter in this case, we also need to provide the initial state of the data. Otherwise, it won't be able to find what we're looking for. So we will take this object, essentially responsible for storing our initial state, and then we will pass it here. If you do not have a very big initial state, then you can essentially pass in that variable name here itself. You don't have to create a separate structure for it, but this is kind of like a little bit cleaner when you're working with it. Okay, and the last thing that we need is to create the setters, and the setters here are called as reducers, right? So we will use the key, which is reducers, since it's an object, and then within this we are going to provide the reducers for each and every state that we have here. So how many do we see here? 4 for the languages and 4 for the companies. So we need to create in total 8 different reducers, which will specify the setters of those reducers. Okay, so let me do one and you will understand what I am trying to tell you to do. Okay, so here we are going to do set, and then we will copy this guy here. Okay, and paste it. And we will change this to camel casing because the set was the first word here. So we're going to set up this reducer. This reducer is going to take a callback function as an input, and we're going to use the arrow notation to set this up. The parameters of this callback function is going to be the state as well as the action. All right. And then these two parameters will be fed into the function body, which will essentially be responsible for performing the state update operation. So it will take the state of this guy here. What are we doing right now? We're doing Python here. Okay. So it will take the state and it will update it by using the action parameter within which there is a property called payload, which is the actual data, and it will overwrite the state. So to repeat again, what did we do? We created a setter, which is basically a key or a data member of our reducers. Okay, so here, and note here, this is plural, reducers, because we will have multiple of them. If you notice here, this is singular reducer because we are working with just a single reducer, right? So that difference, sometimes it hits a bug when people forget that. All right, so what are we doing in the reducer? We are setting up our first reducer, this whole key value thing that we have from here, this bracket to this bracket all together. All right, so this is basically the first reducer. And what this is setting up for? Well, this is setting up for this guy here, this key value, which is basically the first setter, as you can see from the name itself. The setter, when it will be invoked later on, it will receive as arguments basically the state and action. Okay, the state will be identifying which actual variable are you trying to update. That's the state, right? State in state management is the container, the variable, the object of the array that you're trying to update. So what it does, it takes the state and action. Action is basically the actual data value that you are going to receive, okay, that will be present. So you take the state and then call upon this particular variable, because from this setter, I want to update only this key member. Okay, so I'm accessing using the dot operator, this particular key member, okay, because this is planted onto this initial state altogether. And then I'm overwriting whatever the value of this state is with the action parameters property called payload. And payload is basically the actual value. Okay, it's just new set of terms, but in your head, you need to remember what you are actually doing. All right, so now once this setter is done, essentially, we need to move on to the next set of setters. All right, so that means I will follow the same suit here. I'm not yet closing the reducers because I'm not done. I need to write 7 more here, okay, because I have how many options? 8 options, and I just did 1 option. So then I will write down 1 more so that you understand. So we will set the language option, but this time not for Python. We are going to set it for Java, because that is the next key member in our state object. Okay, so then what we do, this is also going to be basically a key member, and that key member is again going to take our state and action parameter as input to the callback function, which will be fed into the function body. In the function body, we are going to call on the state object, and we will refer to language option Java. Notice that when we hit state dot, right, it's an object, it captures the entire initial state. That is coming from this guy here, because we specified that the initial state is what the state we are trying to track, right? So we need Java here. And what do we need to do? We need to update this state with the action parameters payload member. Okay, the property, the payload property, and that will be essentially done. So that will essentially allow us to do the second reducer, right? So now we just have to repeat this for every state key member that we have, right? So I'm going to copy paste the rest of it. So don't get too surprised or overwhelmed. It's the same sort of actions that we are doing here. So I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to paste the same set of code, but I'm just going to change the name of the option every time. Okay, but the structure remains the same. So I will paste it here. So just to walk you through, we did the same thing for JavaScript, which is changed the name. The setup remains the same. Did the same for C language, Facebook, Apple, Netflix, and Google, right? We just changed the names. Everything else kind of remains the same. And after that, the reducer closes here. So all the reducers are now set up. That is, now we have all the setters. Okay. And then the data slice closes as well. All right. So now we have created the reducers. Okay. And in your head, when we say that we have created the reducers, how you should translate it is that using the Redux setup, we have created our setters. This setters is what we will be accessing from any component anywhere within our application if we are ever in a position to update these values. All right. So now the writing part is done to the data store, or for this particular question slice, right? Or this particular data slice. Now we need to enable the reading part of it. That is, we need to enable a way such that people can read the data from the state, because all of this is going to write the data to the state. So now we need to set up the reading part of it. So what we need to do is, in order to read the data, we have to create what we call as selectors, which are nothing but getters, if you think from object-oriented programming, right? And we cannot just create it, we need to export it, because here, if you notice, we have exported this, basically this object, which has the reducers. So the reducers are set up for export options, right? And it will be exported to our data store eventually. But we need to set up, and since this is also the question, the data slice itself, that is why this is going directly to the store. But we don't have to export the selectors to the data store, because that is not a part of our data slice as such. But in order to read the data, we need to enable some getters which will be accessed directly from within the application itself, right? So that is what we want to set up for here. So what we will do here is we will first do the same process. That is, we are going to set the export statement, and then we're going to create the setter. Like we did here for our data slice, we had the export statement, and then we created the data slice, which is basically an object instance, and had our setters, which is called reducers here in this particular case. Okay. So here, what are we going to export? Well, we are going to say select, okay, and then same process, 8 variables, create selectors for all 8. So here I will say language, option, Python, all in camel casing, okay. And what is this going to take? Think about it for a second. When you are writing a reducer, which is essentially a setter, what information do you need from the application to update a variable? Think about it. Ask yourself that if I'm writing something, right, if I'm performing a write operation, what are the pieces of information or instructions do I need to tell somebody to complete my write operation? So say you are a store owner, right? And I am some piece of component in the app. And I come to you, and my objective is that you have some shelves behind your store, right? Different shelves, 1, 2, 3, 4 shelves, and each shelf has some sort of a bottle, right? And I need to fill that bottle with some stones, rubbles, waters, whatever it is, right? So when I come to you, what do I need to tell you such that you can do that operation for me or give you? Can somebody think? Do you understand the question? If you're able to overcome this thinking process, you will understand what is happening here. So is the question clear? That's the first thing. Do you understand the question?
I understand the question. I just don't know the answer.
So what do I need to provide you? If I come to your store, you have, let's say, 4 different shelves. Each shelf has 5 bottles, and I am holding a handful of rubble, right? So what information do I need to give you as the store owner so you can take that rubble from my hand and put it in one of the bottles?
What jar it's supposed to go into?
Right. And where are the jars set up? It's in the shelves, right? It's in one of the shelves. So I need to tell you which shelf and which bottle. And then I need to provide you with the rubble itself, so you can take that rubble and put it in that, right? So that is what is happening here. You're telling me which state to update, and then the action has the actual data value within it. So that is why this reducer, this setter that you see within your reducers, it's called a reducer. Let us keep referring to it as reducers, has a state and an action. And then the state gets updated with the payload of the action. So there is a payload which consists of the actual data itself, right? So the action has a payload, which is then updating the state, whatever you're referring to. But when you want the bottle back, that is, if I go to you as a store owner, and if I tell you that, hey, I want a bottle. So what do you tell the store owner? that give me the bottle which is on shelf 1, third column, something like this. So similarly, when you are reading the data from this particular, or when you're creating your selectors, you don't provide it with an action because there is no data to update. There is only data to read. So the only thing that will go in as a parameter here is the state, because you're reading. So you need to tell which state do you want to read. Okay, this will be fed, excuse me. Okay, so this will be fed into state dot, and then we will have things like question data, because that is the slice. Remember, this is the name of the data slice that we have created, which is the question slice. So we need to refer to this particular data slice because the initial state or the most up-to-date state is being managed within this container here. So we cannot refer to this guy directly because this guy is just the initial state. But the selectors or the getters that we are setting up needs to read the most up-to-date state. So that is why we always need to refer to this state here, which is present within the data slice, such that we can always receive the up-to-date state. All right. Otherwise, if you directly tie it up to this initial state, then you will miss out on any update that might have happened in between that has been done by these reducers, right? So that is why we take the state, but then we go to the question data. And now within question data, we can access the language option for, this is for Python, right? So we are going to set it for Python itself. Okay, and that's it. That's all you do. All right, and now you need to repeat this operation 7 more times for all of the 7 different variables that we have in our state container, right? So again, to repeat, you first need to export it such that your application can call on this guy here that we are setting up. Okay, this is going to have a callback function as a parameter. Okay, and then that callback function's parameter is going to be the state, because if you're selecting something, you need to tell what exactly are you trying to select. So that will be fed into a function body. Since this is a single line function body, I'm not wrapping it up in curly braces. Even if you do, Prettier will throw it out of the window. So this state is going to refer to our data slice, because our data slice has our reducers, which are responsible for updating our initial state. Okay, so we always need to refer to this to get the most up-to-date value. And then from within that data slice, we are referring to the variable for set language or language option Python. So we will get the most up-to-date value. So this same process will then be repeated 7 more times. Okay, so I will copy paste that. All right, and then I will show you, oh God, we need to, can I just move this in one go? Let me just try this one thing. All right, okay, so same indentation level. All right, so what is happening here? The same thing, if you notice, we create the selector for Java using the selector prefix or select prefix, pass in the state that will identify that we are referring to Java itself. And essentially that is what this body of this callback function is doing. It is taking the state variable or the state object, and then it is referring to the data slice itself. And then within the data slice, it is referring to the member, which is language option Java. So this gives us the most up-to-date value of Java itself, right? So once everything is done, all we need to now do is finally export this reducers. Okay, so all of these reducers that we have, this whole package, this needs to be set up for a export statement as well. So we need to export, and now we have a default because there is just one reducer in this whole file. Okay, and then we're trying to export that reducer because look at this. This export statement is for this guy. What is this guy? This is your data slice. Okay, these export statements are for your selectors. So do you notice something that doesn't have an export statement yet? So your data slice is an export statement which will be sent to the store. Done. Your selector has, all of your selectors have a bunch of export statement which can then be used in the application itself. Done. So what is missing? What hasn't been exported yet? This guy, the reducers, right? Which are basically the setters that we have in our data slice. Because if you do not export this, you cannot update your state. Right now, you can export your data slice itself and bring it in the store to configure the store itself. You have the export for your selectors, but you don't have an export statement for your reducers. And how many reducers do you see in this entire file? Just one. Okay, and that is the reason why we are doing export default. And then where is this reducer present? In question slice dot reducers, okay, or reducer, I think. Right, so we need to take this guy out of the file such that it can be used within the application. So we can directly call on these guys here, just as we can do it for this. Okay, so this is the process of setting up a Redux state management. All right, initial state. Okay, so let's do it step by step, a revision of what are the processes that we went through. We first got in a create slice object from our Redux.js toolkit package. This will essentially help us set up the data slice itself. Every data slice corresponds to, let's say, storing the data from a given context. Okay, so here you can think of every component can have a data slice if that is what it does. Okay, or you can put everything together as well, but that is not suggested for clean code documentation. Second step, set up your initial state, which is like a universal state, whether you do global state management or local state management. You set up your initial state. Third, you have to set up your setters. When you use Redux, okay, your setters are within your data slice itself. So we have to first set up the data slice, which can then be exported to our data store. So the data store knows where the data slice is. So I'm going to use my create slice that I imported here using this constructor. I'm going to pass in a bunch of parameters. What are the parameters for that constructor? I'm going to give this data slice a name, a label, so that I can refer to it. So I'm going to call it question data. I'm going to provide it with the initial state. And then I'm going to create a bunch of reducers, which essentially translates to creating a bunch of setters. Now the setters will have a unique way of, well, setting it up. So what you do, it is basically a key value member. Okay, you set the key, and the key is basically going to be the name of the function or the reducer that you will call from within your application. So it will have the prefix set followed by the name of the state variable that you are creating the reducer for, right? The value is going to be a callback function. The callback function will have a parameter, two parameters, which state and what is the action that you want to carry out on this particular state. That will be fed to a function body, wherein you will take the action parameter, which has a property called payload, which is the actual value that is present, which will be sent from the application. That will overwrite the state dot whatever the key is, right? So this state dot something is basically coming from this object type setup that we have here, okay? Not a direct variable. All right, we do the same thing for all of the remaining variables, and we are done setting up the data slice itself. And please don't forget the export statement for the data slice. Next, we created the getters. That is when we want to read the values of the most up-to-date state, we create these selectors. We hit an export statement first so that these selectors can be used. And then we give it a name with the select prefix. Okay, we don't say get, we say select, because in Redux, these are called selectors. Setters are called reducers, right? And then it also has a callback function as its value, okay? And then it only has the state, because when you're reading data, you don't have to pass in data. You just have to ask for where you want the data from. So that is essentially the state parameter is what will help us achieve that. And then we pass it to a function body. The state refers to the data slice, because now the data slice will have the most up-to-date state variable and not the initial state. We have already tied up the initial state within our data slice. So think of it hierarchically, that the initial state goes into the update state. And when you want to read it from where you are doing the update operations. All right. So that is why we have state dot question data, which is essentially the label that I have given to my slice that I have created. And then within that, I am accessing these individual state members. All right, so that I get the most up-to-date value. So this will just return the most up-to-date values. Finally, once everything is done, I export my reducer that is basically being created here. So this is what I need to achieve here, the reducer itself. Okay. All right. So that is essentially all you need to do with respect to the state management. All right. So now you need to tie up the loop. That is, you need to connect. Our data store is ready. Our data slice is ready, but we still have not established the communication of our application itself with the data store itself, because we said this data store will wrap the entire application up. So the first thing that we need to do here is we need to first and foremost import the data store. So how do we import? We write down import and we give it a name, whatever name you want to call it with. So let's say I will call it the store. And then where do I get it from? So app.json is in the root folder. My data store is also in the root folder. So here it is, this file that I'm trying to bring in. So I will import this, right? And the only thing that I need to do is I need to wrap this entire application that you see here, this entire, right, within a function component call, which is called provider. Okay, and close it here. All right, and you can see here, this provider is coming from the React Redux. So this is the connection between React and Redux. This guy, this provider, this functional component call bridges the gap between React and Redux. Everything that we did to this point was Redux based because we were using the Redux.js toolkit and all those stuff, right? So it was all toolkit of Redux. This is now integrating Redux to React, okay? Not React Native specifically. There is nothing specific about React Native as such. That's just an environment for native platforms, okay? So we need a provider. This provider is coming from the React Native, okay? So the way we need to do this is we need to complete this function call. So we will say provider here. And this provider, who is the provider of our application? Where do we get the data from? Anyone? Quickly. Where is the data that will be provided to this application? Who is providing the data? Where is that stored? Anyone? Who is providing, where is the data to this store, this particular application located?
Question slice?
Yeah, but the question slice is a subpart of what? What are we slicing up? We are slicing up the, anyone? The data store. This guy, if you notice here, this is where the question slice is. This is the data store. Again, the data store wraps the app, right? So that means the data store is the provider to our application. It is providing the data. So that means here in this functional component call, we need to provide a prop because this is React code. So you need to recall again React props, right? So this is going to provide with this store, okay? And now all we have to do is we need to take this guy, which is basically what was previously our app, and we need to move it here. So remember, as I started off, I said my entire application will be wrapped by Redux. This is how we have achieved that. So let's save this. So now this provider is coming from this React Redux package. So that means this provider is a functional call which understands how to connect React-based code to Redux toolkit. Okay, and then who is our provider? Our provider is basically the file, or well, in a logical way of speaking, metaphorically, it's the person or the individual who is providing us with all of the data. And what is the landing page or the landing point of all of that data? It is the store.js that we created. Within this store.js, we can create multiple data slices. It doesn't matter, 1 or 2 or 3 or n number, right? We can create all of this again. We can create a bunch of reducers here and we can import all of the slice files here. So that is why we are providing the store as the data provider, because regardless how many times you slice up the store, if you provide this as the input, then this application that you're wrapping up within the provider, they all will be able to interact with that particular store. Okay, so that will be made possible, right? So that is what we are essentially achieving with this particular stuff. All right. Okay, so now we can, like a lot of the, what do you call it? Major portions of our application is done. We have set up navigation, we have set up data management. Now all that remains is to kind of work with our screens, our app logic. Okay, and what you do with our app logic? Well, that's up to your logic, right? So I will go ahead and perform my app logic. So my app logic says that I have a screen here. The screen will provide some questions and there will be some sort of submit button. So we will do one by one. So what I'm going to do is within this screen, I will do a component call. Okay, and these are all React code. This is not React Native that we're doing. We have already set up the React Native environment. If you drop this code with correct logic and CSS, you're ready, right? So that's all you need, right? So essentially, within the first screen, I will do a component call. And what is my first screen? My first screen is basically my questions screen that I have here, okay? So I'm not going to write the logic of my code here. I'm going to write the logic of my code in the component, which will be invoked in this particular screen, okay? And that is this question card.js file, okay? So that is what we will be, that is where we will be doing the main logic of our stuff. Now, in order to use checkboxes, you will find a lot of resources on checkboxes online. Half of them doesn't work. The one that I figured out does work, requires us to install the package on Expo itself and not on React Native. Okay, so I'm going to give you that package here. So if you are interested in using your checkbox element in your project, then essentially you just have to follow this step. Otherwise, if you go looking for it in the internet, you will have a lot of trial and errors that will happen. So what we want to do is we want to install and compile for the Expo environment, essentially this package that is called as Expo-checkbox. Okay, so this will allow us to be able to use the checkbox within the React Native environment. The reason why we are doing this is because there are certain libraries for React Native checkboxes component. The problem is some of them are deprecated, some of them are not maintained anymore. So it will give you an error during installation. It will say it is outdated and stuff like that. So there's a lot of like headache trying to work with all of them or trying to make that work. You may write your own checkboxes. You can be a little bit creative with CSS and you can set it up with event listeners. But if you want a checkbox that looks like a checkbox, works like a checkbox, then there is a package from Expo and not React Native that allows us to do checkboxes, which is basically the Expo-checkbox environment. But this needs to be installed with Expo and not React Native. Okay, so React Native has nothing to do here, but you can use that component here itself. All right. So once you have that checkboxes that you have installed, you need to kind of import that to this particular file. So we are going to say import, and we will call it checkbox, and that it directly recognizes that I'm bringing it from Expo checkboxes package, which I just installed. Now, two things that we have to get out of the way right from the get-go: state management. We have set up state management. Now we need to know how to use the state management. All right. So to use state management of Redux, you need to know how to call the reducers, which are basically your setters. And you need to know how to call the selectors, which are basically your getters. That allows you to perform write and read operations. All right. So you cannot directly just call it because it's not a function name. Secondly, it's not present here. It's not present within this particular life cycle, right? This file's life cycle. It's somewhere else, right? Think about it this way. This application, this particular card component will be invoked in the question screen. This question screen is located here in app.js. This app.js is wrapped by the provider, which is taking store as a React prop. The store has a question slice, and then within this slice file, we have the reducer. So that's a lot of jumps that we have to make, right? But life becomes easier when you have React hooks. So I will write this comment here, and you would want to make a note of it to remember what is happening. We use a hook called use dispatch, TCH. Okay. It is a part of the React Redux library. This is used for calling the reducers. I'm going to write it as a reducer. In your head, remember, we will be referring to the setters. Okay. Then there is another hook called use selectors, which is also part of the React Redux package, which is used for the getters, or basically for the selectors. So we call this hook, and within the hook, we call the name of the reducer that we need. So that hook allows us to directly make connection to that location where the reducers are, granted everything else is set up correctly, right? So in this particular component, we are going to update everything because the user is going to give true and false and stuff like that. So we have to keep a track of that, right? So it's all about write operations here in this particular component. In the component which will be used in screen 2, which is to give a confirmation to the users about what is happening, there we need the selectors specifically. So we will see the examples separately so that it's clear how they work, right? But you can combine them into a single file depending on the logic that you're trying to implement. So I'm going to import this guy here real quick. Right, so use dispatch. This is the guy that we want. Okay, so this is going to be the import statement that we need. And then we need to import all of those reducers right away, right? So we need the file to be present here. So just like if you look at any of these files, right, you have to bring in the question screen, you have to bring in the answer screen, you have to bring in the data store before you can refer to any of them in a given file. So we need to do the same thing here. So I will remove this question screen. We don't think we need the data store anymore, but I will keep it. All right. So we need to get or import all of those reducers, right? So if you need the selectors as well, you need to import all of the selectors. All right. So here I will go ahead and import my selector package as well, my selector hook. So this is going to be use selector, and this will come from React Redux package. So I've imported the hooks. Now I need to import the file or the actual reducers and selectors, which I had exported here. So you can see here, there are export statements for each selector. And then there is a default export statement for my reducer, which is referring to this guy here. Okay, so I need to import these components into the file where I want to use them. And then in order to connect with them, I will have to use these, either this hook called use dispatch for the reducer and the use selector for the selector itself, right? So in order to do the import statement, it's pretty straightforward. And so I will just say here, import reducers from data slice file. Okay, so what did I import? I imported all of the different reducers that we have. So you can see here, the name is basically the same as the name that I have given here for my reducers here. So set language option Python, set language option Java, all the way down to set company option Google, right? So I need all of them to be present here. And where are they stored? They are stored one level up, because right now I'm in a subfolder for components. So I need to go one level up. Then I need to go to the slices directory. And then I need to go to the file called question slice. And within that is where you will find the export statement for the reducers. And this is directly connecting to this export statement that we wrote at the very end here. Okay. All right. So now we need to do the same thing for our selectors as well. So we need to import all the selectors. Although I don't think we will need selectors here, but I'll just show it to you so that you can start working on this if you are interested on your own project itself. So how are the selectors going to be imported? Just in the same fashion as we imported the reducers, we are going to use an import statement, give an object bracket, and then write the name separated by comma from this file. Okay, and these are the names directly for our selectors. You can see here all of the selector names. All I did was did a mass import. I could write it individually, but that's going to take up a lot of multiple lines. So instead of doing that, I just created an object import and I just separated it with comma, right? One after the other. So it understands what is needed, right? And then I need one more import here, which is to the navigation trigger. Remember I said that we need a trigger to move from screen 1 to screen 2, right? So we need basically an import statement, which is going to allow us to use this navigation that we have set up here in our main app page, right? So that is going to be with the help of use navigation, which is coming from React Navigation native package, okay? So this will have a function called navigate. So we will be using that. All right. So now that we have all of the components imported, we have to set up our dispatch. Okay, so this hook that we had, use dispatch, we have to create a new instance of that hook. And using that instance, we are going to call upon all of the different, or we need to set up the original state of all of these different state variables that we have that we are trying to update. Okay, so it's easy to lose. So we will go a little bit slow here to set it up. So the first thing that we are going to do within the component, before the return statement, we will create a new instance of the use dispatch hook. That's the first step that you need to do. Okay. So I'm going to say a declaration called constant dispatch. And this is basically going to be a new instance of the use dispatch hook. Okay, so that means I'm going to do use dispatch. All right, so that is done. Then I'm going to create local variables that will be able to store the values from the data store. Okay, so if I ever need to kind of work on any of these variables, then I can work on them, right? So essentially, this will allow me to store or handle the data that is coming from the Redux data store inside my local file. I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. All the data is set up somewhere. You go and buy something from the store. Let's say you buy some kind of flour or something like that for baking purposes. You buy sugar and stuff like that. What do? You bring it from the store and then you put it in a container within your house for long-term keeping and stuff like that, whatever it is. So what I'm going to do right now exactly mimics that behavior, that using this dispatch, okay, this will be for writing operation, but what happens when we call on the selectors? Selectors will get the value back, right? What happens when we do some update operation? We have to temporarily store those values somewhere before we can send it to the dispatch, right? I hope everybody is understanding what I'm trying to say here, right? So we need a set of local variables which will act as temporary locations for all of these data values that will come here, right? And the way we are going to do it is we are going to set up a variable name. So let's say we will say const, and we will do the same variable name so that there is no confusion. And then instead of setting it to an empty state or empty value or true or false value, whatever it is, we are going to use our selector, okay, which is basically a function call. And then we are going to specify which selector that we want to use. And here we can see the selector that we want for Python is this select language. So whatever the most up-to-date state of Python of that particular state is, it will be stored into this local variable, this temporary variable that we have created for this component, and it will be saved here. So anytime we want to make any type of processing within this component, we don't have to continuously call the selector all the time, because we are doing a one-time operation. We are bringing in the value. Of course, if the value changes, you have to do another call, right? So this will store temporarily whatever the most up-to-date value is, okay? And then we are going to perform this operation for all of the different state variables that we have. So I did the same thing for Java, JavaScript, and C. And then for the companies, Facebook, Apple, Netflix, and Google, right? We are using the selectors. We're calling the specific selectors, which can be accessed here from the import statement. If you don't do this import statement, this will essentially give you an error, right? And then finally, we have imported this, not finally, but the next step, that we have imported. Where is my navigation import? Here. The navigation trigger that I have created, I need to create a new instance of this navigation trigger, right? So here, create a new instance of use navigation. All right. So anytime you want to create a new instance, I'm going to give it a name. So I will say constant navigation. All right. And this is going to be use navigation. All right. And it will be empty. We don't have to pass it any parameters. This, oh, I made a mistake. Navigation. All right. So this instance is what will help us perform that navigation. Okay. All right. So coming now to the actual logic of the app itself. So now we have to write the logic of the app. So this will require us to use some React Native core components. All right. As you can see here, view in React stands for div in HTML. So we are creating sections. Any text that you want to write within React Native needs to be wrapped within this text component. Okay. So similarly, we will have different stuff that we will use here from the 20 odd React Native core components that is there in the React Native development file, right? So the way I like to do it, thinking myself, you know, if we are all beginners here, right? So React Native documentation. So we go to the React Native documentation, we open it up. All right, let me find this guy here. All right, so this is what I do. I open this up generally when I'm doing my own code, right? Thinking like we are first timers. We go here, open the React Native documentation. It's right now at 0.71 version. You can see how new it is. You can see here, there is core components and native components. All right, you click on that and it will show you all of the different core components. And it also tells me that what is the analogy of the core components in React Native with the web component. And I know the web component. I know what a div is. I know what a P is. I know what an image is. So whenever I figure out that, okay, what do I want to do? I look at this core component definitions, okay, which has its full documentations here. Okay, so I come here and this is all the core components that I have. You can see here, starting from this activity indicator to this virtualized list. That's all there is. There's no more than that, right? So what I do is I check that file. It shows me what is the web equivalent. Even if it doesn't, all I need to do is look at this, think about what it does, and figure out, okay, so here I can see that there is a text and there's a text input. I visit each of these components. It tells me what it does. And the moment it tells me what it does, I'm good there. Then it has a fully functional prototype example that is given here, okay, which is also supported by Expo. Do the functional component. Class component is slowly reducing in popularity. So don't do the class component. Do the functional component, life is much easier, right? And you get it done. Next is text input. What does the text input say? Text input basically allows us to on-change text events and read user input. This is just like our input text box. So I know this is the input text box, right? Button. If you want to do button, it gives you the full code for the button. You do it, get it out of there, paste it in your code, and then you're done, right? So this is how you're going to learn, because since you're dealing with a less number of core components, it's much easier to tackle it just by looking at what is it. One thing that I will tell you, in cell phones or in native platforms, when we click something, we press it, right? It's not a mouse click, it's a human touch, okay, or touch of a S Pen or whatever, right? So generally, the way you want to implement your applications is by using this component, which is touchable opacity. Okay, that gives you that feeling of when you press here, you see I'm clicking it here, but when you deploy this to your web application and stuff like that, this is how you will see it. Okay, so when you press it, you can check what is happening or how it is creating in your iOS device, in your Android device. And you can also scan the QR code here. This is also using Expo, and this will be sending it on your actual device as well, and you can check it out. So these codes can be tested immediately. If you have the Expo Go app on your mobile phones, you can immediately see what these codes are doing and you can decide for yourself if this is what you want to do for your apps or not, right? So it's a pretty quick way of figuring things out here, at least when it comes to the React Native core components itself. All right, so enough talking, and let's do some doing. So I'm going to remove this. The first thing that I kind of like to do, and I would suggest you all to do, is to kind of get this safe area view. Okay, so this is coming from React Native itself. Okay, so we will plug this in. So I think this will import it here, safe area view. Okay, so what this does is, it typically doesn't work for Android all the time, but essentially the goal of including this, and it works perfectly well for what do you call that, iOS, right? But the goal of this guy here is to prevent the application from bleeding into this status bar that you see at the top, right? So it should stop it, but for Android device, for some reason, it doesn't behave in the way that you would like it to. So then you have to kind of support that for at least for Android devices using style sheet. But I have seen from feedback from other students that it works well enough for iOS devices. So you can start up. Okay. All right. So now all that we have to do is write the app logic. So now we are outside of the React Native, Redux, and all of those headache. The focus is just on how to develop this application, right? So now all you have to do is, how would you have developed this application on the web, and find the equivalent React Native component and just go for it, right? So I need to present two questions here. I want to create two division wrappers that will store these two questions and their options. And within that, I will have text for each question. And then I will give some set of options, which will be using this checkbox, which I brought in somewhere here, this checkbox guy that I brought in. That is how I'm going to create my whole page. Right. Okay, what is division for React Native? It's views. All right, so I'm going to set up a view. Okay, and within the view, I'm going to provide some sort of a text. All right, so when you provide some text, you are going to use the text React Native component that is available. You cannot have free floating text inside of React Native. Please keep that in mind. You always have to wrap your text within the text component. So you can give some sort of welcome message here. Welcome, dear user, something like this, right? And now you can also do inline styling for your code here. Either you can use this inline styling here. You can specify the style here itself, or you can use this style sheet component. Remember, this is a React Native component, and you can specify your styling option in JavaScript as an object indicator, right? So key member, key member, key member. So one of the ways that you can write the styling directly here, if you want to, is by using the style prop. Here, everything is a prop because everything is a component call. So revisiting React, everything will be a prop, right? So the way you're going to do it is this prop will be written as a JavaScript code. So it will be wrapping itself in the curly braces, all right? And then it will be written as an object, okay? So that requires another set of curly braces. That's why you have two curly braces here, all right? And then we can do something like font size, all right? And everything is JavaScript within this particular code area, right? And then you can do padding, bottom, and these are from CSS, right? All I'm doing is I'm writing this in JavaScript so that I'm using camel case, right? And that will take care of your stuff, right? Of your stuff. Okay, why did it give me these braces? Did I put braces here? I did not remember. Okay, anyways, we don't need double quotes there. Okay, so we will relieve ourselves from that double quotes. So we don't need that string. All right, so welcome, dear user. We can give this. After a welcome message, we can start providing the questions. All right, so that means after this, I can create another view. All right, and within this view, I need to give some sort of text again. All right, so I will give text. All right, and the text is basically my first question, which will say something like, choose your preferred programming language. Okay, and this text is done. And the next thing that we need to do is basically provide the options. Okay, the way we are going to provide the option is by using our checkboxes. All right, so what we are going to do here, just after this view is just meant for the question itself. If you want to put it, if you want to put the answers within this view as well, then that is up to you. It's all app design logic. Okay, so you decide how you want to present your information or how do you want to divide it out. So I'm going to create another division, which is basically view. Okay, but now I'm going to use my checkbox. So my checkbox is this guy here, which is coming from export checkbox package. And then what I need from this checkbox is it's a self-closing tag. Checkboxes are going to be self-closing tag. And then I need to set up the event listener. So if I show you this, you can set up the event listener with Redux for anything that you do within your application, as long as you know which component to use. All right. So for checkbox specifically, there is an option called disabled or not. If you set disabled to true, users cannot interact with the checkbox. So I'm going to set the disabled to false. All right. Then there is another prop, and that prop is going to be what is the initial value of this checkbox. All right. So the initial value of this checkbox is going to be whatever value you read from the state. And where is that value stored? That value is stored in this guy here, language option Python, because that's the first option that I'm going to provide here. So never give a static value. Connect your value of your input boxes to your state itself. So that is why we needed the selector here. Okay. Now, once you have set up the initial value, you need to set up your event listener itself. In React, how do we set up event listeners? By using properties, right? So here we are going to say on value change. If you guys were paying attention, you recall when I was talking about the documentation, I saw on value change, right? So that is exactly what I'm using here. So on value change, what is going to happen? What I'm going to do, I'm going to wrap it in the curly brackets, which is going to be basically my JavaScript code, indication of my JavaScript code. But what do I need to do? I need to take this value that has changed and I need to update the state. All right. So that means I need to call my dispatch, which will call the exact reducer, which will receive the new value and then be able to update the state of the value. All right. So step by step, I will create a callback function, which will take a parameter, which is going to be the new value that I will receive from the users. So in checkboxes, it's going to be either true or false. But if you have a text field and stuff like that, you get the idea what this new value is going to indicate, right? Here, within the function body, I'm going to call my dispatch. Remember, I created a new instance of dispatch here, which is calling, or which is an instance of the hook use dispatch. This hook allows us to connect with these imports that we have made for our reducers. All right, so I'm going to do that exactly here. So I'm going to call on that dispatch and I'm going to refer to the setter that I need, which is set language for Python specifically. And that is a setter. So it will take a input parameter, which is going to be my payload, specific payload. And the payload is actually my new value. Okay, and that kind of completes my event listener option. So what happened? The event listener is set up, which is on value change event listener. Okay, the on value change event listener takes the value itself, which is kind of associated to this particular value here. Then it passes it to a dispatch call. Dispatch is basically invoking that Redux store, right? Dispatch is sending it an instruction to the Redux store that do this. And what is that do this operation? The do this operation is referring to a reducer, which is nothing but a setter. And that setter is coming with a payload or an actual data value, which is stored in this iterator or this parameter, which is new value. Okay, that is connected to this. So you can use the same pattern for any kind of input output interaction that you want from your user, and you can continue this process. Right? So you can do the same thing for the rest of the code as well. So we need to just repeat this view here that you see for all of the options that we have. Okay. And of course, we have to give a little bit of label before we close this particular view specifically. And that we can do it here. We can just say text Python. Okay. Because we don't have a label for this checkbox. So this Python that we have written here will be shown right besides the checkbox, or however you set up your styling, right? So all you need to do now, once everything is done, you need to kind of repeat this process, and you need to do it for all the set of questions that you have in your operation. So I'm going to just copy that, and I'm just going to paste it. Okay, so this is a lot of code that is going to come, but it's a repetitive code. So don't again get overwhelmed. All I'm doing is I am taking this view that I just wrote here from line 63 to line 68, and I'm just changing the options. That is, I'm changing Python to Java, to the companies and all that. So you're going to see 7 such repetition here, and it's going to come with some style sheet objects as well. All right, so that's all we have. It gives us a lot of errors because I probably have missed some of the view there, but I can fix that. Okay, so that's all I did here. You can see here, it's just for different options. I'm just calling its respective setters and its respective getters, and everything else is the same. All right, so the last piece of information that I want to kind of show you before I wrap up today's class, so just give me 5 minutes, please, is the trigger that will take us to the next option. So I showed you how to do the button there, right? So if we go back to our React Native documentation, we go to the button, we see we have this piece of code. So I just copy this piece of code, all right, and I use it in my own code. And then I just add the event listener to it, which will be a little bit different from the button itself, right? So here, I'm going to put this button, okay? And I think I'm missing a view here, if I'm not wrong. We have to find this. We have missed some nesting of the view component somewhere. We need to come back to this part here and solve this error. But focus on this button. Everything is copied from the code that I just showed, right? If we do it side by side, we can kind of check it here. Where is my code? All right, so let's minimize this. Let's minimize this. Okay, so look at this. So we have a title, and the title is going to be shown as submit. I use some sort of a color because it allows me to do some sort of color. So I put a color here, and then I have an on press, and then I have an accessibility label for added accessibility. So I'm not using that yet, but on press, because you're going to press the button, is going to do a callback function. So this is referring to a function itself, right? Remember how we did it in React? It refers to a function, and we have to write the function definition. Instead of creating a separate function, here I'm inlining the function call itself. That is, I'm defining the function where it is being called itself. So what is it doing? It's taking no parameters. It's calling this navigation instance, which I had created here at the beginning of my functional component. Okay, it's calling this navigation instance, and it's calling a method called navigate, which takes a parameter, and that parameter is basically the name of the screen where you want to navigate. Now, if you look at it here in your navigation setup in your app.js, we have given each screen a label. When that label is called, this guy here, this stack.navigator, knows that this component needs to be loaded, right? So what I'm doing here is I'm calling using the instance of this navigation that I have created, and I'm calling a method called navigate, which takes a parameter, which is basically the name of the next screen. And that's it. That basically ties the loop of the navigation. All right. So if this is done, you need to set up your export, and you need to essentially have your style sheets. So I'll give you the style sheet here. It's mostly CSS. There is nothing to kind of discuss here with respect to CSS. You can check these things out. I'm just using flex stuff and all these things, padding and stuff. So, and that's it. And now we have to make a call to this component in our question screen, and we are done. Okay, at least for the first screen. Okay, so we will wrap up here, and I will finish off the rest of the code that is remaining. That is the second screen that we have, and we will tie everything up, and we will test it out how it looks in the screen. But we have covered almost all of the important components that we have. So if you start kind of adopting these things that we have learned in the last 3 classes for React Native, then you can start making some progress with your project as well, right? Small steps will help you later on to not get too much frustrated in finishing off this particular application. Okay, so please do practice. As long as it remains fresh and you practice, it will be more helpful. All right, so I'll stop the recording here and I will see you all Tuesday, which is going to be the last class, and we'll finish up this application in that last class. All right, thank you.